And we're good to go.
All right, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Mike Barnett. I serve as Academic Director of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth session in our inaugural QUASI seminar series. These seminars are designed as debates on important topics related to social innovation, but our aim isn't to convince you that a certain perspective or answer is correct. We're not here to crown winners in these debates, as tempting as that can be. Instead, we want to enrich and refine the research questions that scholars use when studying these topics. As editors, reviewers, readers, writers, and teachers of the material underlying these debates, we know all too well that too much of the literature focuses on uninteresting questions that only rehash and rename established ideas. It's our sincere hope that by pointing out what is known on all sides of a debate in very pointed and direct ways, that we can drive researchers to produce sharper advances in our understanding of how to help business better serve society. Today, we debate the question, is the firm a meaningful unit of analysis for social innovation? Arguing in the affirmative is a dynamic duo featuring the mayor of Social Innovation Town, Johanna Mair, and the hub of every academic network, a man who never misses the mark, Marc Ventresca. Arguing against is another fearsome twosome. There's no one quite as unique as Irene Henriques. And here to tell us why, we've got Tyler Rye. Moderating this mayhem, she's going to bend those social innovation arguments like Beckman. I give you Christine Beckman. All right, each in turn will argue their position. As they do so, please stay muted and post any questions or comments in the chat box. When we get to Christine, she'll synthesize and extend the arguments through questions she'll pose to the panelists. The open discussion will occur after all of our presenters have spoken in a half hour or so that will remain thereafter. So let's get the party started. Over to you, Johanna.
Thank you so much, Mike. I tried to share my screen and I hope you can see it well. Let me just get organized here. Welcome, everyone. It's evening here in Berlin. I'm excited to be here. And let me get started. We have a full agenda today. So our shared objective today is to develop a richer and more refined research questions about social innovation. And my task is to argue that the firm is the ideal unit of analysis to move the knowledge frontier on social innovation. Well, let me start with actually two disclaimers. I have to start with a disclaimer that I will not use the label firm. That has to do with my resistance to buy into the conception of the firm as a microeconomic concept that states that the firm exists and makes decisions to maximize the profits. And it has to do of my resistance to accept what a lot of organizational scholars are doing is just to build on that and pretend that organizations pursue just one goal. Now, I favor a concept of the organization as a political arena, as sites of multiple agendas, motives, and goals. And I also have to do another disclaimer. Of course, organizations are also culprits. They are responsible for creating new social ills and for environmental disasters. How they operate makes them complicit in the reproduction of entrenched inequalities. And yes, today, I'm going to argue out of an image of the organization as a force of positive change. I need to also spend 2 seconds on the second concept here, social innovation. And of course, we can spend the whole session on defining social innovation. I define it very broadly as a process to address social problems and societal challenges in a new way. I must admit that I do not find the search for the one and only definition of social innovation as particularly exciting from an intellectual point of view. After all, societal challenges, social problems vary and change. So as scholars, I truly believe that we need to situate the definition we use in our projects in space and time. Having said that, turning definitions of social innovation into the object of study can be quite revealing. And speaking to research on categories in a recent paper, Mirto Kliova and Alfred Wernes and I tried to explain why the label of social entrepreneurship remains so ambiguous over time. But let me turn to the 3 points that will hopefully convince you that organizations are indeed an ideal site for research on social innovation. First, organizations are the primary sites to understand innovation and scaling. Now, Jim Marc always reminds us that not all ideas are good ideas, actually quite the opposite. And obviously, he also has taught us about exploration and exploitation, about uncertainty and learning. So contrary to popular beliefs, innovation per se does not create impact. And what do I mean by impact? By impact, I mean progress on a social problem, societal challenges. Innovation is wasteful. It's an investment. So if you look at innovation as a process, you see it here. It's a roller coaster, and you are swamped in an ocean of uncertainties. Of course, innovation helps you to learn a lot about the problem and solution space, about the competencies that you need, and about the identity, your own identity. But what creates impact from innovation is scaling, the sweat, blood, and tears work of scaling. And here I don't only refer to improvements in quantity, but also quality. So from the perspective of an organizational scholar, innovation and scaling, of course, they are different, distinct organizational processes. They even require the organization to invest in different competencies and capabilities. And yet we need to analyze them together in order to understand organizational pathways to impact. So focusing on the organization as unit of analysis allows us to understand how innovation and scaling hang together. And this, of course, opens up a whole range of questions we need to put our fingers on. And I just list a few here. What are the pathologies that derail an organization from this productive path of moving from innovation to scaling? How do organizations suppress such pathologies? What are different archetypes or how innovation and scaling hang together? So now moving from looking inside the organization towards something that also, again, canonical research in organizational helps us to see or remind us that we really need to try to understand how organizations are affected and affect their environment. And this moves me towards organizations as the machine room for social change that allow us to understand better or build a repertoire of transformation processes. As a community of scholars, we have made great progress on understanding organizing around social problems. The excitement around or the relabeling of social enterprises as hybrid organizations has certainly helped to build legitimacy for studying such organizations. However, we have largely analyzed what organizations do from the perspective of form, organizational form, and less from the perspective of how they interact with their target group and how they intervene in their environment. My suggestion is that we use the interventions, the programs, or these organizations design and implement as an empirical window to understand processes of transformation. Now, studying how organizations intervene in social system by focusing on these programs requires deep engagement with the organization, the problem, the people, and the communities affected. And also the literatures that already try to make sense of these problems and contexts. Now, an example of this is work that we have done over 15 years, actually, where we try to understand how can one organization possibly make a difference to altering entrenched patterns of inequality in rural India. We identified a transformation process, in our case, scaffolding, and specified the mechanisms that underpin that. So I do see the potential for us as a community of scholars to conduct mechanism-based inquiry that allows us to create a knowledge base around transformative processes. And that will also allow us who study organization a seat on the table to join conversations with other scholars, such as, you know, if I think about the tradition of Albert Hirschman or James Scott. Now, moving on to my third and last point today is I would love us to actually think about opportunities studying organizations to interrogate in the first place the mandate organizations have in carrying out social innovation. Now, the question here is, how do we justify and appraise organizations doing social innovation? Of course, we have paid increasing attention to how to measure social performance. But what I'm missing is conversations about how we assess private organizational actors carrying out social innovation from a societal perspective. Now, questions on justification and appraisal, of course, are questions of normative theory. They take me personally out of my comfort zone. I'm a social scientist. I'm in the business of prediction and explanation. So I have the great fortune to work on this with Ted Lechterman, who is a political philosopher. So in the conversations with Ted, I realized, or the conversations made me see, that most of our research is really not explicit about the normative claims we base our arguments on. So we realized that most research published in AMR and in AMJ presupposes that tackling social problems directly is equally the responsibility of any and every organization. Now, that's a position that in philosophy is known as common good anarchism. Juxtaposing that would be the tradition of John Rawls, ideas from liberal democratic political philosophy, and building on his work, basically, I mean, here centering on a societal division of labor between private and public entities as the normative ideal for society. Now, building on Rawls, it could potentially, if we want to engage, offer an alternative perspective. So seen from this vantage point, the work of private organizations doing social innovation needs to be assessed beyond solving social problems. We would also need to ask how they complement and supplement the ideal societal division of labor, and how they facilitate transition to a more just society.
That's your playoff music, so please do wrap up.
Yes, and I wrap up with actually research on organizations and social innovation having a bright future. We ought to stop asking how organizations cope with conflicting logics. We have to start asking how they make progress on social problems and what their mandate is. And I'm going to wrap up. And my own hope for this field is that this is a field of a disciplined imagination and disciplined exploration based on conceptual clarity, empirical rigor, and practical usefulness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let's head on over to the no side with Irene.
Thank you. Just let me set this up right now. I'm going to share my screen here. So you're going to see that. Let's go here. Can you see my screen?
Affirmative.
Can you see it? Which one do you see? The big one?
I think so. Yeah.
Why the ecosystem is a more meaningful?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, wonderful.
Is there something better that we can see instead, or this is?
No, which one are you seeing? Okay, hold on.
Good. Thank you.
Is it tiny? I gave you the big screen.
Don't worry, we're seeing the right one.
You're seeing the right one? Well, thank you very much for inviting me. This has been a pleasure, and I'm honored to be with such great scholars on this. Now, thank you, Mike, for inviting me. And I'm going on the no side. And what's interesting is companies now are being asked to address social issues. But Einstein said, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. So what options do we have? Well, in the latest AMR from the editors, they argue that, that's Alvarez-Zander et al., argue that interaction amongst a wide variety of economic actors in an ecosystem is what allows firms to exist. So being inside or outside a firm doesn't really make sense. What you're looking at is that you have to look at the obligations as a social actor, as an interdependent ecosystem in which we live in. In that sense, then, this question about what we measure and what counts also has to go beyond the firm, going into this ecosystem, learning what the limits are and what the barriers are. So what are, in fact, the outcomes that firms seek from social innovations, and what impacts will they have on the recipients of these social innovations is something that we need to ask. If it is environmental, for example, is a firm-centric target appropriate? So the ecosystem is a fascinating unit of analysis, of course, to which to study social innovation. So an ecosystem in this case would look at, instead of firm-centric targeting, we're going to look at system-level targets. And that's exactly what the SDGs are. And now, of course, with the Sustainable Development Goals about no hunger, and it includes things like zero hunger, good health, no poverty, well-being, reduced inequality, climate action, etc. All these are targets, but they're system-level targets. They're not firm-level targets. So how do we create an aspirational? How do we create these aspirational levels for firms within a region, within a country, within a community, whatever you want to do? And this is critically important. So there's also the Science-Based Target Initiative, which comes from Europe. Europe is always ahead of everything, insofar as looking at it as concrete examples where firms sign into looking at these targets as a system level rather than firm level, and see where they can fit into this measure. And so there's a need for systematic changes in corporate sustainability to enable sustainable production as well. We're sort of closed right now, right? We almost look at a firm sells a product and we end, but there's the other side where consumers, what do they do with the product afterwards? Lots of waste. Where can we actually take responsibility for what happens after the product or service is sold? And that's something that's critically important. And then corporations need to develop more holistic understanding of the production, distribution, consumption of their products or services on ecosystems. So Whiteman, Walker, and Perego talk about this. So to develop more broader actions to include the redesign of products, the processes to reduce environmental and social impacts, product stewardship, protection of habitats, operation within regions, environmental capacity. I've worked with engineers, I've worked with scientists. It's amazing what they bring to the table. And they bring into the table, to our discussion, this issue of the limits, the carrying capacity, which sometimes in management we tend to ignore, and we need to bring that in. What does that mean for innovation processes? What does that mean insofar as moving forward? How do we measure this? And of course, there also needs a measure to measure these social impacts. What are the measures? Barnett, Henriques, and Susta in 2020 and John have talked about the fact that we sort of stop at what sort of measurement at the firm level, but we don't go beyond. How do we do that? And we need more research in this area as well. So everyone designs who devises a course of action aimed at changing existing situation into a preferred one. So we need aspirational models, and think about it. Well, we did some interesting things. This is another paper I did with some colleagues at the Gadi Business School in Monterrey. And we actually did a case study on a little village of about 1,600 people. And we went in there and we looked at what do they do. And now they had a problem because the community was faced with the possibility that a quarry was going to come in. And of course, they needed jobs. But the NGOs and the businesses within that community said, well, do I really need this? This is going to be bad for our community. So they said, so they called on the Gadi business people to come in and take a look at this and reframe, try to find new ways, sort of clean up things, sort of synthesize and try to work this through. It was fascinating, going into a community, participatory action research within the community to look at this. So this is what the community looked like before. And this was our aspirational model after. So the idea was we worked with the community, trying in each section to see how things are interlinked. So what's fascinating about this is that there's issues about the oregano that expanded to look at oils and other things. The cheese company now is losing its way, before it wasn't, to make other products, to make protein. Unfortunately, the lumber mill did not want to get involved, unfortunately. And then, of course, there was this urban farm to get the community engaged in doing this. So what we have is this ability to actually go in, talk to people, see how this scales, what works, what doesn't. So these are the things that were fascinating in this village. But we also have an ecosystem constraints that lays bare biophysical constraints. What are the things that worked that didn't? And what's interesting right now is I'm working with Anna Maria Pareto, Rick Colburn, Bettina Schneider, and Robert Anderson on a 5-year project looking at indigenous social entrepreneurship. And what we're trying to do is co-generate and co-create knowledge and experiences in which indigenous worldview is blended. Things that like collaboration, community, sustainability, the sense of place, this importance of looking at future generations. We're going to synthesize this and say, well, how does this compare to the Western view of entrepreneurship? Is there a way to blend the two together, to think of and to think about all these constraints? Because when we were talking to indigenous elders, they were always talking to us that we are sort of not on the earth, we're not connected. And so what this Cree Indian proverb says, only when the last tree has died and the last river has been poisoned and the last fish been caught, will we realize we cannot eat money. Fascinating. But the idea is that we need to that interconnection, that community, those processes to see what are the needs, how do we measure this, how do we go forward? I will end with some new research questions. A design approach is needed to help companies address their position in the ecosystem. ROM 2003 calls for an ideal target system that can inspire, motivate, enable agents to develop new organizational processes and systems where success or failure and each solution reveals more information. In the Higuera's case, we saw things that failed, but that then helped us, if we were to move forward, how to improve things the next time. What are things we need to do? In other words, there are a host of CSR activities that can be chosen to address and eliminate hunger, for example, but which activity is the most efficient and effective means to do the most good? There is where we need some more research. We can do this, but we need a systems approach to it. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Irene. And now let's pivot back and get another bite at the yes side of things. Marc.
That's great, Mike. Thanks very much. Let me just share my screen. I'm going to stop other people sharing, I guess, in that brutal sense. All right, I'm really happy to be here as well. Thank you for bringing us along, and thank you to everyone who's joined us. Now I'm just trying to get a screen share going. Yeah, really happy to be doing this. It's a great and important set of questions, and I think Johanna has really reminded us of the kind of 3 core issues. We want to see symmetry. We want to understand firms and organizations and ventures and what they do, and also good things they do, pro-social things, and also the difficult things they do. And she's reminded us of the value of re-engaging with political philosophy and beginning to distinguish normative and other positions, something I will also say. I think Irene has given us a very rich argument for ecosystems and illustrated that with some of her own work, reminding us of the variety of communities and stakeholders that are relevant. I want to pick up on both these and go a little slightly different direction around research design. So is the organization, I'm also using organization, not firm, a meaningful unit of analysis to study social innovation. So I think this is an important debate where and how to study units of analysis. I'm going to talk about a couple of issues. I want to remind us of the vexed issues of research design in general. I think the prominence of a number of standard, now incumbent theories of organization may well have blinded us to interesting and important questions around research design issues, units and levels of analysis, and also the over time and comparative studies. I think as organization theory and strategy and innovation studies have matured, in many ways, they take advantage of new tools, but we have maybe misspecified or neglected old debates around what I'm going to emphasize, comparative and longitudinal data. I recognize that the questions around comparative and longitudinal data raise lots of difficult questions around access to data, who has data, what count as data. We have well codified tools that provide us views, data sources that are firm or venture centric. I think Irene reminded us of the richness of now what's available to understand ecosystems. But I just want to get us thinking again about those conversations to bring back on this agenda, whether it's the term firm or other organization, also the term social innovation, something Johanna also mentioned. In our preparation, our team talked a lot about what do we mean by social innovation, what kind of social innovation, who's interested. I think those are useful questions. I just want to brief on one current project we're doing with colleagues at the Skoll Foundation, looking at a set of ventures that they have funded over time, trying to understand systems change. I'm going to talk a little bit about that work to help us think about some of these issues. And then finally, I want to end focusing why focus on organization and why focus on organizations. I have several observations with regard to Mike's encouragement to both come up with a new research question, also to come up with what we shouldn't be looking at and ways to rethink the research tools and approaches that we have. So the questions around design, research design, I think for me are both technical and also philosophical. How do we study? What do we study? How do we know what we're seeing? In general, as someone who comes out of a tradition that was historically minded, I think we look too much at the cross-section, particularly in these studies of social innovation. It's a policy problem. You know, we fund things, foundations fund things, or policymakers fund things for 3 years and say, have you fixed poverty, right? So there's a foreshortened concept here around time. And I think one of our responses as researchers and policy advisors is to re-emphasize the need to really understand complex process over time and in time. And so there's a substantial toolkit available, traditional tools in the study of using tools like regression analysis, event history models, increasingly opportunities with computer and computational text modeling, and the so-called new computational social sciences. So there are many interesting ways that we can begin to imagine new sources of data and also data over time. That could be historical time, it could be longitudinal time in the experience and life cycle of agencies and projects. It could be durational time. In other words, there are many ways we can theorize and re-engage with time. There's a nice literature growing in the management tradition in strategy and organizations. There's a longer debate on that and a longer literature in sociology, political science, economics. So again, that's always a debate around theory and methods. What kind of questions do we want to ask? What kind of tools do we have to do that? I'm using the chance today to remind us that the units of analysis question is really a research design question and merits that debate. As Irene said, there are a series of essays recently, most recently in AMJ, and also in other of the leading journals that emphasize these questions, but I think we do well to foreground this notion. Theory methods is a debate, they're not separate, it's a package, and part of our work today in this area of understanding social innovation involves that. I think the other issue there is one that both Irene and Johanna touched on, I'm sure Tyler will and Christina as well. What do we mean by social innovation? I think that's many questions. The field, and I think both the policy field and practice, and I think academic studies have moved from only thinking about that in a positive sense. We're now much wiser about the unintended consequences of all kinds of initiatives. Our convener here, Mike Barnett, and his colleagues have, of course, raised those issues as well. So I think we're today, 2020 and going forward, we're working with a much more supple and rich view of what social innovation is and what it is we're trying to study. I'm not going to go further on that for right now, but just to underscore, that is a debate that we need to be having regularly. In some of my work, and something I'll talk about today, the project with the Skoll colleagues, we've really looked at the succession of key terms, keywords like systems change, social innovation, social justice, social entrepreneurship, scale. Others on the panel have done that as well. Tracking those terms reminds us how much the object or the focus of our analysis has shifted over time. One hopes, and I'll say it in that way, one hopes that there is consequent learning in terms of research design and research focus that goes along with those shifts and histories. You can date that from 30 years ago on with early work on microfinance and so forth. You can date it earlier, 80 years ago, to the kind of renewed focus of modern states in social welfare and in the New Deal, the series of New Deals. We could date it to the 60s and the interest in Donella Meadows and colleagues in the Club of Rome interested in sustainability. The point is, one of our tasks is to integrate these lessons around keywords and how they move along. I'll turn just briefly to the project we're doing with the Skoll Foundation. We've taken up this question of a goal for a lot of interested funders and policymakers and people is, how is it that firms and ventures and organizations of all kinds engage in and promote systems change? Part of our work has been a curious debate over what do we mean by systems change, not unlike what do we mean by social innovation. I underscore those debates are not nihilistic. They're not, it all means anything, but really trying to be more precise about what are the conceptions of these terms that we sign up for, both as researchers and practitioners. We've looked at 30-some global funders, a mix of global North and global South funders, and what they fund and how they talk about what they fund when they promote systems change. My colleague Paulo Savage, a postdoc with us and faculty at Durham, is a wonderful contributor in this project. Very first findings, we find 7 different ways that funders in practice think about and fund systems change. Each of these has its own meaning, its own ontology, its own impacts. And so I put this up here just to remind us there's a kind of a clarity that both Johanna and Irene have reminded us about when we use this focal question, is the firm or the organization the key unit of analysis to understand social innovation? I think we have to do the work of understanding what we mean by that. Each of these have their own theories of action, their own theories of intervention. So we quickly begin to have a richer understanding of the work. I want to move quickly then, happy to in conversation and question and answer, pick up on both these issues around the units of analysis debate and also this particular case. I want to move to Mike's kind of core to remind us about what are the questions we should be asking, what are the questions we need to stop asking, how do we begin to change emphases. I have a number here of topics and issues, and I'll speak through them quickly and then wrap up so we hear from Tyler and then Christine, and then lots of time for questions. So my overall request today is that we really refocus on research design, and we rethink that in terms of both practice and policy desiderata. In other words, what do we want to know and for whom? This is not a call to become biased players, to lose the kind of position of outsider researchers, but it is a question to say we need to think about research design in terms of what we can know based on the designs that we're using and how those possibilities reflect and resonate with both practice and policy considerations. This is a move that's happened across many of the applied social sciences, in education, in social work, in medicine, in many other areas. It's not a provocative position. My normative claims are we need to start from comparative and longitudinal design, and we need to integrate the lessons from a very rich portfolio of cross-sectional studies and single case studies which dominate in the social innovation space to really inform these new designs. So this is work of translation, it's intermediary work, it's often work that is neglected by particularly elite research academics. We want to reflect on that. I think we also need tools and theory to thread together the diverse studies of forms of organizations. It's an old debate. Paul DiMaggio and many others in the 80s got us thinking about ecologies of forms, ecologies of communities of organization. That literature largely died for methodological reasons or debates over how to study that. Again, I think the new text rendering tools refers to the Hannigan et al. Paper in the Annals that are really helping us think about text analyses and new forms of researcher-driven insight to open those questions up. I think we want to recognize inductive questions. It's something we've grappled a lot with in the Skoll Foundation project. We want to learn from the reports and applications and experiences of ventures. That's the term theory of change. Many of us know a term that is both sympathetic to the work of practice and also more of a rationale and making explicit assumptions than either a theory or a conception of change. We also, though, need to think about when to bring more normative models to assess those accounts. My colleague Mariah Beshrov has really led in that with many of her colleagues and others. We're interested there in saying we have to both understand what the people on the ground think and do, and also we have some obligation to translate and critique those. Finally, I think we want to study the adjacent possible. This is a term Stuart Kaufman at the Santa Fe Institute has pioneered. We want to study about what becomes possible once you do something and the world changes around you and because of what you've done. That's a novel idea, really familiar in our studies of innovation. I want to encourage us to bring the adjacent possible into this question of research design, focusing on units of analysis. And finally, we've emphasized institutions, complexity, and logics a lot. I'm a fan of all those things. I think it's time to stop emphasizing them as much and really begin to build a generation of work that builds bold conjectures that both simplify and reconnect to context. So thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Marc. Really appreciate taking it back to the core ideas of the revised research questions. And now we move from Oxfordifornia and over to the East Coast here and join Tyler for a take on the no side.
All right, let me just get my slides presenting. All right, fantastic. Just want to confirm that everyone can see me, see my slides, hear me. We're all good. So terrific. So nothing intimidating at all about going forth in this batting order. So that's great. And I was really flattered to get the invitation to be a part of this session because number one, I really truly believe that this is an important question. And number two, I was really happy I got assigned to argue the, I think the factually correct position here that the firm really isn't the best unit of analysis if we're going to study social innovation. So, you know, with great respect and deference to both Johanna and Marc, you know, I'm quite happy to be arguing this side of the debate and not theirs. So I'm going to take a little bit of a liberty here. So when I was thinking about this bigger question about, you know, is the firm a meaningful level of analysis and is it a meaningful level of analysis to understand social innovation? You know, I grappled a little bit with what is social innovation. So Marc, I was glad that you brought that up. Johanna as well, but ultimately decided to punt a little bit on that and take a bit of a liberty and, you know, do a little bit of interpreting of what the real question is here that we're interested in answering. And I think that, you know, if we're going to pose a question like, are firms a meaningful unit of analysis or social innovation, I think it's useful to take it back a step and actually ask, you know, how are social innovations generated? Where will they work? And what effects do they have? And then use that as the frame for thinking through, does the firm play a role in any of these levels of analysis and any of these outcomes, which I think are really the ones that we're the most interested in addressing. So want to dive into each of these, and I'm going to be bombastic on purpose here. I mean, of course, the firm matters as a level of analysis, but I'm going to argue that, you know, really, if we want to get a fix on these questions, we need to look in different areas than the organization. So first question here, how are social innovations generated? Now, as a gross simplification of this large literature in organizations and innovation, I think that most of the stuff that's out there about organizational level innovation, be it social or otherwise, really gets at the tactics of innovation. So exploration versus exploitation. We have a really rich literature bubbling up in the social enterprise space around hybrids, paradoxes, and tensions. And I think this is all great in terms of understanding the nuts and bolts of how organizations do these things. But I think there's a more important and more fundamental question that we need to ask, which is, you know, who decides to pursue social innovations in the first place? And so I think that this sort of teaches away from the organization as a unit of analysis, and we need to look at who the people are. So who are the social and institutional entrepreneurs who are doing this work? Who are the people inside organizations that are actually making the decision to pursue social innovation as a strategic priority? And so not only that, I think we need to look at what are the decision-making influences that actually give rise to these choices to pursue a social innovation. And so we can look at individual level factors. So we obviously have great research on the role of disciplinary training, tying that to institutional logics, individuals' roles and identities. And I think that there's a real interesting opportunity to really engage seriously with the literature on cognition and heuristics. How do people think about multiple goals at the same time? How do we get beyond this idea that people are either oriented towards business or society, and actually embrace the idea that people can try and pursue both in a single decision, investment, whatever it might be, and use that as a way to get a line of sight on how social innovation gets kicked off. We also know that there's a lot of external factors that influence decisions about social innovation. So there's a lot of mimesis, there's a lot of models that serve as templates for these sorts of decisions. And once individuals have engaged in social innovations, there's diffusion, right? And so there's a scholar that some of you might have heard of, Johanna Mair, who has this really nice paper looking at different templates in social enterprise. And I think that it's these sort of things that we need to look at. What are the models that are out there in the world that serve as the basis for people to imitate, elaborate on, and then scale up, as opposed to looking at just organizations themselves. In addition to that, there's another scholar who I respect a lot, Ventresca, I think his name is, has talked about social movements, field frames, and the role this has in decision-making around social innovation. I've done some work with my friend and colleague, Adam Cobb, around resource dependencies. And then obviously we know that there's external pressures that stem from legitimacy challenges that are leading a lot of organizations these days to think about social innovation. So just wanted to anchor this on an empirical example related to some research that I'm doing right now with Mike Useem and Kevin Chua. And this is regarding the Business Roundtable statement redefining the purpose of a corporation. So for anyone who's not familiar, the Business Roundtable is this sort of Masters of the Universe club. It's 190 CEOs of some of the largest companies in the US, maybe beyond the US as well, but anyway, big companies mostly in the US. And they signed this declaration in August 2019, which is really, I think, a social innovation, redefining what they consider the purpose of a corporation to be, from the Milton Friedman, shareholder wealth generation definition, to defining a corporation as an entity that's there to create value for all stakeholders. So something that would be uncontroversial in our literature, but certainly an innovation on the ground for these companies. And so when you look at how this decision unfolded and how this statement came into being, you can look at external pressures, the broader zeitgeist that embeds this. So we see the rise of impact investment. We see progressives increasingly challenging the legitimacy of shareholder wealth creation as the dominant mode of business. We see consumer trends and preferences shifting. And then these things are shaping the decisions of individuals like Larry Flink at BlackRock, who started to talk about the importance of actually modeling out ESG considerations in BlackRock's portfolio construction. And then Jamie Dimon, who is the head of the Business Roundtable, really embracing this, and these two together sort of being the catalyst for getting this statement up and off the ground. And then we see mimesis happen. So based on Larry's statements, Jamie's statements, we see 182 CEOs sign on to the declaration, and we actually track out some evidence of behavioral change that resulted after this declaration was signed at these companies, at least pre-COVID. COVID fucked everything up. Oh, sorry for my French, but it made it a mess. So when we're talking about how social innovations are generated, I think we need to look at individual and field levels as the more meaningful levels of analysis, as opposed to focusing on firms. All right, so second question, where will social innovations work? So again, I think we need to look outside of organizations. So there's great research looking at how you make social innovations work in terms of internally stabilizing the core of an organization. So how do you deal with interpersonal tensions? How do you put up guardrails? How do you resolve these problems that make these organizations unstable? But I think a more important question is, okay, if organizations are going to be doing these social innovations, where are they actually feasible to do as sustainable ongoing initiatives? And where are they likely to stick? And so I think that this, again, pushes us away from the organization as a level of analysis and towards considerations about resource availability. So, what are the resources that are available for social innovation? What are things like impact investing doing to enable social innovations for certain types of individuals and organizations to be pursued? I also think we need to think about, crisis and cognition. So coming back to the individual actor level, COVID hits. What does this mean for social initiatives? Right? Increasingly, the world is beset by natural and man-made disasters. So when these things happen, that are these, massive existential crises for societies and businesses, what does this do to the cognition of individual decision makers? Are they going to stick with social innovations? Are they not? I mean, we know from the threat rigidity hypothesis that, when there are these threats, it's going to centralize decision-making power and lead people to entrench on what's worked in the past. So, is that going to be, social innovation? Probably not. Also important, I think, to look at the institutional context. There are just some contexts where social innovations are going to be more or less feasible by the nature of the environment where they're being implemented. And so to anchor again on an empirical example, this is from a paper that Eric Zhao and I published in Org Science in 2018. And what you're seeing here are interaction plots that look at the relationship between the poverty focus of microfinance institutions and their ability to sustain their operations. And what you see on the left here is we looked at what's the effect of trying to address poverty when poverty is really closely intertwined with categorical inequalities like racial, ethnic, and linguistic discrimination. And you see that, as discrimination is higher in a country, it gets much, much harder to actually sustainably address poverty, right? It's just not something that an organization can do in a sustainable way with outside resource support, right? It's just not a fertile environment for that kind of an innovation to stand up on its own. On the right, you see the influence of market supporting institutions. So what's the effect of trying to do something like microfinance in a country where there's a good base to build on in terms of the market? There's stability, monetary policy, rule of law, et cetera, versus in contexts where it's arguably where you need these innovations, but they're really, really hard to enact in a sustainable way, right? So you see where market institutions are weak, it's really hard to sustain a poverty focus in microfinance. So where will innovations work? I think the institutional context is really where we need to look. Not to say that organizations aren't a useful place to look, but if we're not considering the context that these innovations are taking place in, I think we're missing arguably the bigger piece of the puzzle. Then the last consideration here, what effect do social innovations have? And this is probably the big one, and I think we've all, the panelists touched on it in various ways. And Marc, you mentioned the theory of change model, and so I've got that right here on the slide here, right? So when we're thinking about, what are the actual impacts of a social innovation, this gives us a nice, if a little bit simplistic, framework for thinking through this. So we can think about what are the inputs that go into an initiative, what are the activities that organizational actors engage in, what sorts of outputs did they produce, but then what are the actual outcomes and impacts of these initiatives? And in a paper that Helen Ha and I wrote for Journal of Business Venturing a couple of years ago, we actually looked at what the academic literature, the management literature has focused on. And so, it's all been about the earlier steps in this logic model. And to be clear, I think this is great work, but it doesn't tell us much about outcomes and impacts, like what actually happens when you enact some sort of a social innovation. And coming back to another point that Marc made, do we really know that the social innovation is going to have a positive outcome unless we investigate it? I've done a lot of work on microfinance, and you have people like Esther Duflo, Banerjee, Dean Carlin, saying that maybe microfinance, when you're looking at outcomes and impacts, maybe isn't as good as we think it is. So I think that, if we're going to be serious about this question about, social innovation, we need to go outside of the organizational level. We need to, one, look at aggregate behaviors, right? So the effect of any one individual organization on a social or environmental outcome that we care about is going to be tough to distill, right? Like lots of noise, very little signal. But if we start to aggregate up, we're going to get a cleaner line of sight on these questions. And then I think we really need to look at non-organizational outcome indicators. If we just assume that actions that are well-intentioned are going to have positive outcomes, we set ourselves up for making all sorts of really problematic assumptions that could have materially negative effects in the world. So I think that we need to get outside of that and look at some non-organizational outcome indicators. And again, just another example of this. This is a figure from a paper that Luis Ballesteros, Mike Ucima, and I published in AMJ in 2007.
You're gonna have to pull the hook soon, Tyler. So please do wrap up.
Yeah, this is the last slide. So yeah, and it's just showing, we looked at, how countries recover after natural disasters and what the effect of corporations are in terms of the disaster aid they give. And so we were looking across multiple organizations, aggregate outcomes, and our dependent variable, two of them was Human Development Index was one, and then economic growth was the other. So getting at actual, non-organizational outcome variables. All right, so I'll leave it at that. I think that we need to look at non-organizational impacts if we're going to have a meaningful conversation about this. And yeah, I'm happy to be arguing the no here because I really do truly believe that it is the correct position. All right, thanks for indulging a little extra time for me.
No worries. Thank you very much. Those are great insights. And so now we've had kind of the tennis match of the yes, no, yes, no. And now for the minor task of kind of bringing that all together is Christine.
Terrific. Thank you. Yes, so this is the minor task. So I think, what do I want to do? I've got four quick thoughts here, sort of to try and synthesize that. And just on time, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. So I will try and take less than my allotted time. So the first thing I want to sort of say is, or at least acknowledge, is that none of us gave you a definition of social innovation. Everyone sort of dodged that question. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it, but I want to at least provide two ideas here, right? Two sort of ways of thinking about it in the literature, and to sort of suggest that the panelists are all sort of thinking about it not this way, right? This is defining social innovation much more as a product, as a solution. And I think most of the panelists, I don't know if I can speak for them, but listening to what they said, would describe social innovation more as a process, and really understanding the process and the ways in which new ideas to solve social problems are developed and established. So sort of put that out there, that I think that is the way that most of the panelists were describing social innovation and what it is. The other thing I wanted to throw out, just to be even slightly more provocative, perhaps, having recently moved to a public policy school like Johanna, I've moved from teaching social entrepreneurship MBA students to teaching innovation to masters of public policy and masters of MPAs, and they really think about it quite differently. And I think that notable difference is important as we think about what is social innovation, and this provocative article written by Tom Montgomery, where there's really two different paradigms for social innovation, and most of us in the business world are approaching this from.
That's feared. You're getting kind of auto-tuny. You're
not working.
We'll continue to try. We're getting most of it, I think.
I think it got better, Christine. I think you were okay. I mean, at this point, it got better.
Sorry, I don't know what's wrong with. Okay, yeah, my internet's unstable today for reasons I don't have any control or understanding of. So the technocratic paradigm, I think, is how most of business school folks think about this, and it is the paradigm that where the firm is it's most amenable to thinking about the firm as a unit of analysis.
Sorry,
we really think about entrepreneurs as the experts.
Can we try
creating markets?
I don't know if it'll matter, but maybe if you
shut it
off, it'll give you a little more bandwidth. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll keep. If it doesn't work, Mike, then just sort of take over, and I'll let this be. Okay. All right. So the idea being, markets, entrepreneurship, efficiency being sort of the technocratic paradigm where we think about consumers, and that's really different than the alternative where we think about a democratic paradigm, and where we're really focused on issues of equity, social justice, distribution of power, and knowledge isn't from individuals as entrepreneurs, but around community engagement. And at the continuous engagement, you don't just go to consumers and to figure out what their needs are, and then try and to develop products to solve those needs. It's a continuous engagement, and it's a really different current is how we go big. And so I think it's something that makes us not think the firm then is not as clearly a useful unit of analysis, and I think encourage us to think more broadly. So last point before I want to turn to the research questions, right? So the panelists really talked about the alternative actors to the firm, right? Johanna talked about other organizations. Irene talked about communities. Tyler talked about individuals, but not just organizational actors, also grassroots organizing and individuals in that sense. That innovation is coming from a lot of different places. There are a lot of different actors that we might consider beyond the firm. I think there was actually pretty broad agreement, even on the yes side, that the firm narrowly defined it was not necessarily the way to go, and that's partly because I think we all agreed that we really need to think about the impact beyond the firm and what are the other outcomes we need to consider. You could see this in the in the chat, right? Well, thinking about well-being, thinking about systems level outcomes. I think that's really a useful direction for us to be going. To thinking about, my question sort of also sort of piggybacks on some of the things that the panelists said around, when and how does social innovation redistribute power and achieve more equitable solutions? And Johanna's got a great paper on scaffolding and sort of inequality and how that happens through concealing the goals, and when does it happen very deliberately and as a primary motive, and then thinking about the processes, the systems, and the institutional context for social innovation. Again, focusing on process. Several panelists talked about normative questions around when to bring normative models to assess those theories of change, and then Marc's terrific point around studying these issues in and over time. So just trying to bring together what I was hearing across all the panelists. I think these are some of the questions that I heard as things we should be thinking about going forward. So I think we're right at 9:30, which is exactly what Michael wanted us to do. So we can turn to comments from the panelists to sort of get some of the talk back to other panelists, things you want to agree or disagree with, or me as well, and then turn to the audience. And Michael, maybe I'll let you take charge of this if my audio is still a bit problematic.
Okay, thank you very much. And mostly now it seems to be working. So we'll turn it back. I think at this point, the panelists who have heard from each other now get a chance to, having soaked in all of that, as well as the integrating comments from Christine. Why don't you each just take a crack at responding anything that you might want to add now that you've heard everybody else's argument. Start with Johanna then.
Sure, I'm happy to. Actually, initially we thought of doing this in an Oxford debate, so really getting onto this. So virtually this is difficult, but let me pretend to be a little bit of an Oxford debate and get on to who do I see next here. I see Tyler. Tyler, you are my Oxford debate man now. So everything you mentioned actually could perfectly be consistent with taking organizations as sites where social innovation is carried out, either whether you look at it as a product or service or as a process. Could be that we need to pay attention to who is carrying out that work, but we often study organizations as the site where these people work. Right. Similar also the institutional context. This is exactly where the classical or the canonical work in organizational scholarship really remind us organizations are affected and do affect institutional change. Like I do quite a bit of comparative work that I didn't show here. And the way I look at organizations that actually carry out social innovation, they tell us, they reflect on actually the context. They tell us much more about the countries than our colleagues in political economy can tell us, because they think about categorizing countries, while organizations doing social innovation can tell us where are the cracks in the systems, where really tell us much more about these countries than we think. So I do believe that yes, we can do a lot of the research that you suggested by taking organizations as our our starting point and as a site to do this research.
Thank you. Irene, want to take crack?
I'm going to be short. We won. So I want to hear from the audience. So I'm going to be very short. I think that we have so much to talk about and there's so much research out there. So I want to hear from the audience about what they're doing, how they're bringing some of these ideas forth. So thank you.
It's a cop out. All right. Marc, what do you got?
Just coming back on. Thank you very much. Again, I'll echo Johanna. We have lost sight of these kind of Marxian inspired views of organizations as political arenas. I think especially, and this is something Christine mentioned as well, as people have become more common, the jobs we have in business schools, it's less and less that we hear about organizations as political arenas. Tyler's paper that he mentioned just recently, his recent annals paper does this very well, the interest in corporate diplomacy, or the growing interest in corporate diplomacy that my colleague Mari Sacco and that our colleagues at Wharton are pioneering, I think is a renewed interest in sites of political activity and coalitional struggles. I think that we've argued, our team, Johanna and I have argued for the primacy of focus on organizations, not instead of paying attention to context, I think this is what Tyler's saying, but really seeing organizations as recognizable units and places where you can understand how big events come together in practical ways. I'd remind us all of C. Wright Mill's point about individual biography and broader policy questions. My view is that this literature, this social innovation literature, is ripe for that kind of consolidation. Irene has made exactly the point that there's a lot of research out there. There's very rich work in the chat. I mean, Sandra's just given us a quick summary of some of her work, books and papers. Everyone on this call is active in this area. So I think our task partly now is a synthesis task. It's a schematizing and synthesizing, and I think organizations provide a really useful focus for that work.
All right, thank you very much. And Tyler?
Yeah, so I think that this was a really fascinating debate, and I was really happy to be a part of it. And so, Johanna, you said that you take the Oxford debate approach here and push back a little bit. I'm going to take it in a little bit of a different direction. I think that Irene and I presented our case fairly convincingly, and we don't need to get back in and relitigate that. I think that like Marc said, the interesting work is looking across levels of analysis and really understanding how these pieces of the puzzle fit together. So I was bombastic on purpose in terms of putting together my comments, but I think this is a zoom in, zoom out issue, right? So how tightly do we want to focus? And it's going to make different sorts of questions and processes apparent. And if we zoom out, we're going to see different sorts of things. And so I think we'd be really misguided to not consider the role that organizations play in these processes. But I think if we just look at individual organizations and the internal dynamics, we're missing the forest for the trees a little bit. So that was certainly the impulse behind wanting to push a little bit harder on how are these decisions made, what sorts of considerations motivate people to want to engage in social innovation, and then how can we actually understand the impacts by looking across organizations and at the institutional context.
Okay, thank you very much. And Christine, was there anything you wanted to add to this as well?
Yeah, I mean, no. Let's move to the audience. I do think that we're actually pretty much in agreement across the panel, not in terms of winners or losers, but that organizations are useful units of analysis, but we need to think beyond them, right, and to think of different kinds of outcomes and different kinds of processes. So they spoke together well.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much to the panel. And I started thinking in terms of always the adages about be the change you want to see, and the notion that if everybody just did their right thing, if everybody was sustainable, then does that really aggregate to a sustainable society? I don't think it does. And then you've got the question of why would you individually, if you've got all the free rider issues and everything else going on? So cart ahead of the horse, and a lot of complications to work through and all of this. So the good news is there's no shortage of additional research questions to tackle in this. But let's get to some of the questions. I'll just start with Howard Aldrich. I think you can unmute and to ask your question.
Yes, thanks. Great observations. I wanted to put onto the agenda a development in the last 6 months that shows for me the importance of looking at emergent interorganizational networks when looking at large-scale challenges posed to society. So when the COVID pandemic hit, one of the things that was discovered very quickly in the medical healthcare system was the lack of personal protective equipment, face shields, masks, intubators, all kinds of things. And hospitals, the government, many established organizations discovered they couldn't keep up. And so into the breach, amazingly, in the last 6 months, these interorganizational networks, dozens and eventually hundreds of them, one you might have heard of, these open source medical systems group, came in and they coordinated across organizations and across individual maker spaces, turned out millions and millions of personal protective equipment. So it was a very rapid response by, in some cases, organizations that didn't exist 6 months ago. Open source medical systems, a great example, but there are many others. So I just wanted to mention that we have, and the concepts we're using in this project are concepts that we've had around for a long time: emergence, interrelational networks, ties, legitimacy, lots of things happening there. So I'm calling attention to this because I'm hoping other people who study organizations and social innovation will look at this. It's an extraordinary social experiment that looks like it's being called upon again. There was a temporary lull, but it's happening again now as PPE becomes in short supply. And it's a response by interorganizational networks, not just organizations, not just individuals.
All right, thank you very much. I don't know if there's a question there. Is it anything that the panelists want to
yeah, I just wanted to comment briefly, Howard. And obviously there was a stand I had to take in this debate, and I was assigned to the yes people. But if I think about what type of new projects I would devise, if I study social innovation, I do not start from the organization, but I'm more interested in phenomena that emerge as we speak, and the pandemic has put that out. So we, for example, study the amazing mobilizing around collective efforts to respond to pandemic in Germany, and it's a network of organizations that together with the government that has started something, but at the same time also nested in that are teams, and the teams again we can study with our tools that we know from organizational theory. So I think it, and that's what I try to say. I think we make a mistake if we think about research on social innovation and define it and set in stone today, because it's the societal challenges, they change, they alter, they vary over time, and that makes it such an exciting phenomena for us to study. So being held accountable to a definition of how we studied it 10 years ago will not make us really successful and effective to understand. Thank you for that.
Thanks. Is there anyone else on the panel who would like to respond? Marc, go ahead.
Like I would agree with Johanna and Howard. Thank you. I guess I'd echo this, that when we try to understand these large scale mobilizations, this is where I think it's fruitful to think about networks and social movements. We go beyond any single category of organized activity. I'd also just flag, this is an old debate, and Howard knows this, we all know this. It's a debate between organization, the concept of organization, and the empirical forms it takes. So, I mentioned Charles Tilly. I think his work is very powerful for us today. I think in working with our colleagues at the Skoll Foundation, as some of us know on this call, they have in the last year or two in a transition of leadership, really moved from a long-time commitment to social entrepreneurship as kind of heroic individuals to a language they now use, fields of change makers. And that language, fields of change makers, I think is very congenial to what we all do and know. And Howard, to your point, a lot of these initiatives happen, take shape, are being birthed in either within national jurisdictions, across sectoral issues. I imagine Tyler sees a lot of this in his work as well. Irene's point about the studies they're doing, the idea that these are collective action, emergent, complex, I think is powerful to remind us. I think the idea that there's still organization there that we don't often understand. You know, there's all the colleagues who've done work on open source. I think Mike mentioned this as well. I think there's a chance here, I would say, to really integrate, schematize, come up with a new generation of work and founding concepts. And clearly, you know, Howard, your work is obviously going to shape that.
And I don't think Howard's comments could have been any clearer about just how important it is to actually understand this. I mean, literally life and death types of things.
Can I sort of try and jump on that too, if my audio works? I mean, I also think that, you know, as Howard says in the comments, right? So the nonprofit sector really stepped up, but different actors are better at different parts of this social innovation process, right? It's not just about coming up with the idea. We have to scale. We have to, you know, try things out. We have to diffuse, and so I think that this is the cross-sector part. But you know, government plays an important role in different parts in the process. The private, the nonprofit sector. And so I don't think we want to think of about this as either or, but sort of what are the ways that these different sectors can come together, and what are the strengths they bring to different parts of the social innovation process.
Thank you. It's always more complicated, isn't it? Every time. Let's go with, I'm going to mess up the name, but Tomas Teodorovich, you had a question, if you'd like to.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, Mike, and thanks everyone for this great seminar. I have a question for everyone, but what struck me was Johanna's talk and Marc's talk about the actual measuring firm level outcomes when assessing social innovation. So they're essentially, what is the role of financially measuring social outcomes when thinking about social innovation?
Johanna, do you want to start, or I can start?
No, you can start. I think Tyler was the most explicit one by linking the conversation of management or organizational research to something that is used quite a bit in practice, the logics model. Now, I have my own concerns about those models, and I think because there is a particular performative element to it. But I do believe that the way we think about our DVs in strategy and the holy grail of finding one or two metrics is really counterproductive. And I see that in practice, the standardization of performance regimes, and I see that also in research. Of course, we are all both in practice and probably also in research driven by making things comparable and comparative work. But I think there is something fundamental wrong with that, and this is why I believe that we have to get to normative questions and engage much more with those aspects. I know this doesn't solve your problem because you probably want to find a DV, but my suggestion is find a meaningful DV. And my experience working with a lot of organizations doing work that we classify as social innovation is they intuitively always know how much progress they make on the problems they care, and they have measures, they report on that. It might not be exactly the same metric they have to report to their funders. So if you work with organizations, ask them what do they keep track on, and that gives you a very good indicator what's a meaningful measure of performance when you really are after assessing impact.
Anyone else on the panel?
So if Marc doesn't want to chime in, I'd love to address this as well. So one of the things that I'm doing outside of research is working on starting up an impact investment firm, not a firm, an impact investment fund, actually supporting social enterprises that are emerging out of campus ecosystems. And so we actually have a partner who does impact assessments of the companies that we diligence. And they go through and they line up the impact claims that these companies make against the SDGs, because we need to report to our limited partners, the people who've invested in our fund, how we're assessing impact across our portfolio. But they categorize it according to these 4 impact areas that we've prioritized, and they actually generate an impact multiple of capital. And so they sit down with the founders, look through the claims that they're making about impact, and then sort of, scope this out through the whole theory of change model, and then assign quantitative financial value to the impacts that are happening. And this isn't to say that the normative questions aren't important, because they're two sides of the puzzle, right? So the normative stuff, the qualitative stuff, obviously super important. But by quantifying this, it lets us speak the same language that the people in finance are. And I found it's just an incredibly powerful tool in terms of conveying impact in a way that everyone gets, because everyone understands dollars and cents, capital is very fungible, and actually getting buy-in and getting some quantitative indicator on the kinds of impacts we might be having.
Thanks. The old statement of what gets measured gets done. I think always holds. Along those lines, let's go to Paulo Cotrone. You had a question as well.
Thanks for asking, Mike. But there is a lot of work done on the unintended consequences of measurement, the overflows, the various effects that measures generate. And so if I ask you to define impact, and there are 75 people on this call, very likely it will give 75 definitions of impact. And so how do you measure that? And wouldn't it be better to use numbers instead to interrogate the ambiguity of the notion of impact and things of that kind? And so my first comment on the chat was along these lines. I mean, can we solve the problem of the ambiguity of impact by presupposing it is something easy to measure? And can't we instead develop a different system of metrics that force a debate on what is impactful, on what impact is, on what it means, on where it is generated, how it is generated, what the purpose of those organizing activities are? So more than a question or comment, this is a rant, I would say. Yeah.
All right, who would like to respond to the rant? Irene?
I agree, but as we know, there are many ways of going about to have impact. So if I'm looking at this SDG, for example, with regards to education, right? If you want to have more education, there are other options. I can send books to certain areas, or I can train teachers. So the reality is, I would like to know which one is more efficient. And what they found out in many cases, it's actually training teachers instead of sending books that actually is more efficient. So when I'm talking about measuring impact, I'm making, does it actually purports to do what it said it's going to be doing, whatever activity that you're doing. So those are the things I talk about when I'm trying to talk measuring impact. And that's why, in public policy, they already have in development economics, for example, Duflo and Banerjee have been doing a lot of these, controlled trials. I mean, is it any different? If I did not do this, would the outcome have been any different? So those are the sort of things that we may want to know. And so that's what my purpose insofar as looking at, does something work? Yes or no?
Anybody else on the panel? Marc?
Just really quickly, I just agree with Irene and appreciate Tyler's comments and the other comments on this. The issues here, we're in a period, and Johanna mentioned this, we're in a period of fascination with impact measurement that is probably damaging in the longer term. It's blinding us to the complexity of the situation, to the context, and as Tomas posed, and as we've all grappled with, the eagerness to measure does shape what you do, but also limits and may direct your efforts poorly. And these are efforts that are trying to be done in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, and that the knowledge from a ton of work in impact measurement, but also in systems evaluation, rankings, GDP, GPR, the kind of happiness activities. These are 20 and 30-year projects, which are always incomplete and need to keep updating. And so Paulo's point about the unfolding nature of rationality, the continuous nature, how many disciplines have dealt with this is they have systems of indicators. And I think that's one solution to this effort, is a system of indicators where we recognize plurality, context, different objectives, rather than trying to optimize.
Boy, oh boy, how to find that sweet spot. And then as we add complexity to it, I mean, we all want to have that single number again to kind of summarize it all. So it gets very complicated. Tyler, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say I agree with everything that Marc and Irene said, and also Paolo, I think you made a really great point. You know, the way that I look at it, you know, we need to do the best we can with the tools we have, but I think our role as academics is to be critical about these things, right? Like, we're the ones who are going to interrogate them, identify the limits, you know, and get a fix on how we could improve. So, you know, I'd be reluctant to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but you know, I think we have a real role in terms of being the critics and holding feet to the fire in terms of, you know, are these the right measures? Are they useful? Are they doing what we want them to do, et cetera?
Thanks. Gina Wernberg, did you want to unmute and share your question?
Sorry, which question? I had some numerous questions earlier along.
Dealer's choice, whatever you'd like to ask.
Okay, let me find my question. Hang on one second. Wow. One question I was asking is about using the demographics as a unit of analysis, such as for the dependent variable, let's say Black lives saved as a consequence of interventions around the social determinants of health. And I was wondering people's thoughts on that.
Any takers? Marc, seem to unmute. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, if others aren't going to, I'm happy to. I mean, it's a great idea, Gianna. I know your name, Gianna or Johanna. Gina, sorry, apologies.
Thank you.
Yeah, great set of issues. And I really sympathize to your point earlier about Ostrom. I really want to bring Ostrom back into this conversation. You know, you suggested in the comments I'm going to call them specialized outcomes, not to diminish the importance, but really specific outcomes. I think that's a great idea. I think that gets us into recognizing a lot of specifying many contextual factors. Some of us on the call know Pierre Fiss and the work he's done with qualitative comparative assessment, QCA. They have run a set of models, you may know this, Jenna, they've run a set of models where they said, let's look at pathways out of poverty. And they said, let's look at pathways out of poverty in that QCA combinatorial way for white men, white women, black men, black women. And it turns out you get a very clear view. White men have 18 pathways out of poverty, black women have 4, right? So it's a way of beginning to look at really specialized populations, which are, of course, within themselves still heterogeneous, but modeling what's available, you know, by standard, you know, completion of high school, completion of college, intact family, you know, all the standard variables, but putting them in that Reagan-inspired Pierre Fiss motivated model of what does that tell us about outcomes? And I think that I hear your question about specialized outcomes as an invitation to that kind of analysis. You know, we need to build a constituency for 12 regressions or 12 event histories or whatever that are exploring kind of threshold models or tolerance across very different outcomes. I think that's exciting.
Great. I had one other question about, I asked Irene, help me understand how you define the boundaries of the ecosystem from a local, regional, national, and global perspective. I'd love more thoughts on that.
Sure. What I've done was we actually looked at, insofar what are the issues that the community is facing. In some cases, and for example, in the case of Higueras, it was a small lake. It's only within their region. It was all the issues were mostly local. And so then that's how we sort of dealt with it, depending on because they were co-creating with us, right? They were talking to us about their needs. So we based it on that. Now, insofar as if it's an environmental issue, which is much broader, so if it's climate change, then we're going to have to talk about, insofar as, you know, organizations, it's major organizations across the world. So I would look at, insofar as what the issues that we're looking at are. In the case of indigenous communities, if I go to the East Coast, it's going to be issues of, you know, getting their food security and things like that. The huge issues right now in Nova Scotia, and actually the indigenous community bought out the company that owned the fisheries. And that's one way how they dealt with those issues. So it's really fascinating. So it's going to be in co-creation with the group and talking about how big or how small they want to deal with it and what issues they're facing.
Well, that ties directly to my other comment, which will be my last one now, regarding how this can help overcome the tragedy of the commons and the pitfalls of that.
And that's exactly it, because what they found out in the fisheries is that it's actually the company itself had property rights on all the fisheries, right? And they owned it. And so by taking 50% ownership, they then opened it up to others, right? To actually be able to feed themselves and make a living. So these are the things they came in, they took power in order to do it. So it's a question of power as well, which was fascinating, the whole dynamics. And Sarah Catherine's work, as well as insofar as how they made sense of all this, it was interesting. And the companies themselves, how they made sense, and they realized that they're facing this, and how do they deal with it, and how they dealt with it is, I'm going to sell half my organization to this First Nation community.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Marc, did you have an additional comment you want to make on that?
Really quick on Irene and Jenna, I just agree. I think the Ostrom work, for everyone, if you're not familiar with it, really quickly, I mean, Ostrom argues that tragedy of the commons conventional argument solved only in the literature historically by creating markets and private property, or by creating fiat by states. Her work says communities, as Irene says, communities with many caveats create complex institutions, what she, following Mary Douglas and others, call clumsy institutions. They're inelegant. They don't have the graciousness and the elegance of the market or the state. They're clumsy. They're plural, sedimented, layered. They make visible different kinds of identities and interests over time. There's a temporal element. You know, her focus is really on intergenerational governance of commons. I think there's an enormously useful set of insights that come from that work. And just the way Johanna and Irene are saying, I encourage you, if you've not had a chance to dip into it, there's a number of papers. Shahzan Sari and Johanna Reinecke have a nice paper on climate change frames and rhetorics using an Ostrom focus. There's a lot of work. It borrows from the strengths of what we might call an institutionalist position, but makes that much more supple and situated.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. We could be here all day, I think, with questions. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more, and then we'll close after that. But Sarah Kaplan, I mean, you had a question earlier on, but we probably answered everything that ever needs to be answered already. All right, do you still have a question?
Oh, no, I'm okay. And I know people probably have to go. So I was just fascinated by the conversation, and thanks very much to everyone for this rich discussion. I have lots of papers to now read.
Absolutely. All right. So we've hit the bewitching hour. Sincere thanks to the panelists for a great debate, and give you a virtual clap. Many thanks to all of you who have participated as well. As a reminder, the materials, including the reading list, slides, video, and chat transcripts, will be posted soon. We'll send notice to all registered attendees, and you can find links on the RICSI website, which is at business.rutgers.edu/RICSI, RICSI. Please note that I've set up a Twitter account to use for refinements of any research questions. The Twitter handle is @research_better, and the title is Better Management Research Questions. Another thing to look for is the summer 2022 special issue of Rutgers Business Review. It'll be focused on this seminar series. Most of the presenters have agreed to write pieces for it that summarize and extend their debates. In addition, you may be interested in a call for papers for a special issue of Journal of Business Ethics titled Save Our Cities, Exploring the Intersection of Ethics, Diversity and Inclusion, and Social Innovation in Revitalizing Urban Environments. Ted Baker, Brett Gilbert, Kareem Post, Jeff Robinson, and I are the guest editors, and initial drafts are due on January 17th, 2022, plenty of time. Finally, please do join us for the next session in the new year. Once we've left hellish 2020 behind, we'll debate the question, does corporate lobbying benefit society? That session will feature Brian Richter arguing in the affirmative, David Levy arguing against, Kathy Rabine showing us how it depends, and Asim Prakash as the moderator. It's on Friday, January 22nd, same bat time, same bat place. Hope to see you there. Happy holidays in the meantime. There are more questions. We've already got everybody here. I know Tyler has to run. I don't know if any of the other panelists can stick around, and we could entertain questions from there. Totally your call, because we have fully completed the time, but I'll leave this space open if anybody wants to stick around. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Great job. Thank you.
right, it looks like we do have a few takers. I don't know